You crossed the line before you noticed it. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a moment you could point to. No collapse, no victory, no announcement. Life did not change its voice, but something in you stopped responding the same way. That is how the point of no return actually begins. Not with a decision, not with courage, but with a quiet mismatch between who you are becoming and what used to feel normal. You still show up to the same places. You still speak the same language. You still recognize the faces around you, yet the inner agreement is gone. You listen to conversations that once mattered and feel nothing connect. You return to routines that once stabilized you and feel resistance in your body. Not pain, not fear, just refusal. This is not confusion. This is not boredom. This is not a phase. This is the moment the old timeline loses leverage. Most people misunderstand this stage because nothing seems to be happening. They expect signs. They wait for proof. They assume that if the external world has not shifted, then nothing inside them has either. They are wrong. Real shifts do not push you forward. They pull the ground backward. The world you came from does not explode. It simply stops matching your internal frequency. You begin to notice it in small ways. You hesitate before reacting the way you used to. You pause where your old identity would rush. You feel less urgency to explain yourself, less hunger to be understood, not because you are healed, but because you are no longer negotiating your reality. That is the line you crossed. The moment your nervous system stops fighting to belong to an environment that no longer fits. At first, it feels unsettling. You might question yourself. You might try to recreate the old energy. You might test whether you can still want what you used to want, but the response is muted. The desire does not return. The excitement does not reignite. The old incentives fail to activate you. This is not loss. It is access removal. The old timeline still exists. The people still play their roles. The structures remain intact, but you are no longer plugged into them. Your system has already updated. And here is the part almost no one prepares you for. There is no turning back because there is nothing to go back to inside you. You could try to force it. You could imitate your old reactions. You could perform your former identity convincingly enough to pass, but it will feel heavy, artificial, draining, because once awareness crosses a certain threshold, it cannot pretend on knowing again. This is the true point of no return. Not a moral choice, not a spiritual oath, but a biological and perceptual shift. Your body knows first. It tightens when you try to comply with outdated expectations. It goes quiet when you imagine continuing the same path. It relaxes only when you allow uncertainty rather than repetition. The mind tries to argue. It asks for reasons. It looks for plans. But this transition does not respond to logic. It responds to alignment. You may still be waiting for permission, for validation, for something to happen that justifies what you feel. It will not come, because this stage does not ask you to move forward. It asks you to stop dragging what is already finished. You are not early. You are not late. You are already past the gate. That is why everything feels strangely suspended. Not broken, not chaotic, just paused. The pause exists because your old momentum has ended and the new one has not been assigned yet. This is not a mistake. It is a buffer zone between timelines, a space where your system recalibrates before new structures appear. If you feel like you have gone too far to return but not far enough to arrive, you are exactly where you need to be. Do not rush to label this. Do not rush to fix it. Do not rush to explain it. The moment you name it prematurely, you try to anchor it to the past. Let it remain undefined. Undefined does not mean unsafe. It means open. You did not lose your direction. You outgrew the one you were given. And once that happens, there is no map that works the same way again. This is the silent crossing, the unnoticed threshold, the moment reality stops negotiating with your former self. You did not step into a new life yet, but you have already left the old one behind, and that is enough for now. Nothing ended the way you were taught to expect. There was no collapse, no argument, no final scene that made it obvious something was over. The world did not signal a conclusion. It simply stopped responding. This is how the old timeline actually ends. Most people believe endings are loud. They expect chaos or relief. They wait for drama that confirms a chapter has closed. But real endings are quiet. So quiet that you keep waiting for the reaction that never comes. You say the same words and feel no impact. You repeat the same patterns and feel no movement. You place effort where effort used to work and nothing answers back. Not resistance, not rejection, just silence. That silence is not emptiness. It is absence of connection. The timeline did not break. It disconnected. And this is the part that confuses people. They assume the problem is motivation. They think something is wrong with their emotions. They wonder why things that once triggered passion now feel neutral. It feels like the volume has been turned down on life. The moments that once pulled you in now pass through you. Praise lands flat. Criticism barely registers. Achievements feel thin. Not because you stopped caring, but because the channel you were tuned to no longer exists for you. You are still pressing the same buttons, but the system on the other side has logged you out. This is the silent end no one prepares you for. The end that does not hurt enough to be obvious, and does not reward enough to feel complete. It leaves you in a strange middle space. You might try to provoke a reaction. You might push harder just to feel something. You might question whether you are becoming numb, but numbness has tension. This does not. This feels clean. Too clean to be a breakdown. You notice it when emotional spikes flatten out. The anger that once fueled you cannot rise. The desire that once drove you fades quickly. The fear that once controlled your decisions fails to grip. You keep checking yourself, asking if you should be more upset, asking if you should be more excited, asking if something inside you shut down. It did not shut down. It completed. The old timeline ran its course. And instead of ending with a crash, it ended with a loss of signal. That is why nothing feels wrong enough to fix. The people around you continue as usual. They still react. They still chase. They still defend. But you observe it differently now. Not with superiority. Not with judgment. With distance. The distance is not emotional withdrawal. It is perceptual shift. You see patterns without being pulled into them. You hear familiar narratives without feeling compelled to join. The hooks that once caught you now slide off. This is the moment most people try to force a conclusion. They want closure. They want a reason. They want an explanation they can tell themselves and others. But this ending does not provide one, because it is not an event. It is a disengagement. You did not walk away. The timeline stopped calling you. And when a system stops responding, the instinct is to check yourself. You wonder if you lost ambition, if you lost edge, if you lost purpose. You did not lose anything. You were simply removed from circulation. What once activated your nervous system no longer has access. The silence you feel is not a void. It is the absence of old noise. And that absence can feel unsettling at first. Because noise gave you orientation. It told you who you were reacting to, what you were resisting, what you were trying to prove. Without it, there is no immediate direction. Just stillness. That stillness is not peace yet. It is neutral ground, a space where nothing pulls and nothing pushes. This is why the silent end is so often misread. People label it boredom. They call it fatigue. They try to escape it by creating stimulation. But stimulation does not restore signal. It only delays recognition. The truth is simpler and harder. The old timeline no longer responds because you are no longer meant to respond to it. This is not punishment. It is not loss. It is completion without ceremony. An ending that leaves no wreckage, only space. And space is uncomfortable when you are used to constant feedback. But space is where new structures form. The mistake is trying to fill it too quickly. The moment you rush to replace the old signal, you pull yourself back into a frequency that already released you. The silent end does not ask you to react. It asks you to notice, to recognize that nothing is wrong with the quiet. That the lack of response is not failure. It is confirmation. You did not miss your moment. Your moment ended exactly when it needed to. And now there is nothing to chase, nothing to fix, nothing to conclude. Only the awareness that the conversation you were having with reality has finished. Not with a goodbye, but with a pause. And in that pause, something else begins to organize. Not loudly, not yet, just enough for you to feel that the past no longer answers. And that is how you know the ending already happened. The world did not fall apart. Your life did not collapse. The structures around you are still standing. People are still playing their roles. Schedules continue. Systems run. But something critical changed. The timeline did not lose stability. It lost access to you. This is where most people misread what is happening. They assume change requires departure. They believe transformation means leaving, quitting, escaping. That is not what happened here. You did not walk away. The version of you that once responded to this reality no longer has control. The interface is still visible, but the login credentials stop working. You notice it in the smallest moments. An old trigger appears and nothing fires. A familiar pressure shows up and your body does not comply. A situation that once demanded immediate reaction now meets a pause. Not discipline, not restraint, absence. The reflex simply does not activate. You wait for the surge that used to arrive. The defensiveness, the urgency, the fear that pushed you to act before thinking, it does not come. And this is unsettling because identity lives in reaction. Who you thought you were was defined by what you could not ignore. What made you tense? What made you rush? What made you prove, protect, perform? When those reflexes disappear, it can feel like something vital is missing, but nothing is missing. Something was removed. The old identity did not die. It lost authorization. It no longer has permission to operate your system. This is not a philosophical idea. It is felt physically. You try to summon your old drive and it feels forced. You attempt to recreate familiar urgency and it feels artificial. You mimic your previous reactions and they drain you instead of empowering you. That is the clearest signal of identity access loss. The behaviors still exist conceptually, but they no longer connect to energy. The old version of you is like an application that opens but cannot execute commands. The buttons are there. The responses are not. Fear used to be persuasive. It told you when to move, when to hide, when to conform. Now fear speaks and your body does not listen. It still understands the language, but it no longer believes the message. This is not bravery. This is incompatibility. The frequency that fear uses no longer matches the system you are running. You can hear it without obeying it. That is a profound shift. Most people spend their lives trying to overpower fear, trying to discipline themselves into courage. You did not do that. Fear simply lost its role. The same is true for old desires. The goals that once motivated you still make sense on paper. They still look impressive. They still carry social approval, but they do not move you. You can pursue them if you choose, but there is no pull. And without pull, there is no identity. This is why the transition feels disorienting. You are not becoming someone new yet. You are operating without the old operator. There is a gap between command and response. That gap is where awareness lives. Before this shift, you acted first and understood later. Now you notice first and choose later. That alone changes everything. The timeline still tries to run the same scripts. Situations arise that expect a familiar version of you to show up. People approach you assuming the old reactions are still available, but they are not. You respond slower, quieter, sometimes not at all. Not out of avoidance, out of lack of resonance. This can confuse others. They may think you are disengaged, detached, unmotivated, but what actually happened is deeper. The identity that once negotiated this reality is no longer active. You are present without being reactive, and that presence exposes how much of your past life was driven by automatic patterns. The need to explain yourself, the impulse to defend your choices, the compulsion to seek validation, Those were not personality traits. They were survival programs. Programs designed to function in a specific timeline. That timeline does not have permission to run you anymore. This is why you cannot fully go back even if you try. You can revisit the environment. You can re-enter the conversation. You can repeat the behaviors, but the energy is gone. It feels like wearing an old uniform that no longer fits your body, tight in places, heavy on your shoulders. You realize how much effort it takes to be who you used to be. Effort that once felt normal. This realization is not uplifting. It is sobering because it shows you that your old life required constant self-interference, constant adjustment, constant self-suppression. You lived inside that friction for so long that it felt like identity. Now the friction is gone, and with it, the illusion that struggle defined you. This is why the timeline did not need to collapse. It only needed to lose access. The structures were built for an earlier version of you. When that version stepped out of control, the system stopped syncing. Not because it failed, because it is no longer relevant. You are not waiting to become someone else. You are waiting for the system to catch up to who you already are. This phase can feel empty, but it is not absence. It is autonomy without instruction. You are no longer being pulled by reflex, no longer driven by fear, no longer motivated by outdated rewards. You are still here, just no longer programmable. That is what identity access loss actually means. Not awakening as an idea, but awakening as a function. The moment the old self can no longer log in, and the system has no choice but to reorganize around what remains, which is awareness. And awareness does not need to react to exist. It simply waits. And in that waiting, a new configuration begins to form. Not forced, not rushed, compatible with who you already are now. The emptiness did not arrive because something went wrong. It arrived because nothing rushed in to replace what ended. Your system expected a reward, a signal, some form of confirmation that the transition meant progress. Instead, there was space, and the mind does not trust space. It was trained to expect outcomes, to measure movement by visible change, to equate effort with payoff. So when the old identity steps out and nothing immediately takes its place, the mind interprets that gap as loss. It calls it emptiness. It labels it failure. It searches for what it must have done wrong. But this gap is not a mistake. It is a deliberate delay. The reward did not disappear. It was never meant to arrive, yet. You are standing in a phase where the system is clearing rather than delivering. And clearing feels like nothing. The brain hates this. It asks questions with urgency. Why am I not excited? Why do I not feel accomplished? Why does everything feel neutral? The answers do not satisfy because the brain is asking the wrong question. It is asking when the result will show up. But this phase is not about results. It is about removal. The old incentives are being unplugged. The old rewards are losing their grip. The internal feedback loop that once kept you moving is being dismantled. That dismantling does not feel like progress. It feels like absence, because for a long time, motivation was not coming from alignment. It was coming from tension, from the promise of relief, from the chase of approval, from the avoidance of discomfort. When those drivers shut down, the system does not immediately know how to move. So it pauses. This pause is not laziness. It is recalibration. The emptiness is not emotional. It is structural. Your internal architecture is being reorganized. Think of it this way. Before anything new can stabilize, the old scaffolding has to be removed. Scaffolding is useful during construction, but if it stays too long, it blocks the final structure. What you are experiencing is not the absence of a building. It is the removal of the supports that are no longer needed. That removal creates visible space, and the mind panics in that space. It wants something to hold on to, a direction, a task, a reward to justify stillness. But stillness does not justify itself to the mind. It only makes sense to the body. The body understands when something has ended. It relaxes where it once braced. It softens where it once pushed. That softness is misread as emptiness. but it is actually relief without excitement. And relief without excitement feels wrong to a system addicted to peaks. This is why the emptiness feels unsettling. There is no rush, no pressure, no immediate desire. You are not being pulled forward, and you are no longer being pushed from behind. You are simply here. This exposes a deep conditioning, the belief that movement must be rewarded to be valid. That change must announce itself with pleasure or recognition, but this transition does neither, because it is not about giving you something. It is about taking outdated structures away. The system is clearing space for a new configuration that cannot exist alongside the old one, and that clearing must complete before anything else can stabilize. If the reward arrived now, it would anchor you to the wrong identity. So it does not. Instead, you are given neutrality. And neutrality feels empty to a nervous system used to extremes. You may notice that you are less reactive, but also less enthusiastic, less anxious, but also less driven. This in-between state is not a downgrade. It is a reset. Your baseline is being recalibrated. Before this shift, your sense of being alive was tied to intensity, high stress, high motivation, high anticipation. Now the volume has dropped. And without volume, the mind assumes something is missing. But what is missing is not purpose. It is noise. This is why trying to fill the emptiness does not work. You might chase stimulation. You might seek new goals. You might try to recreate excitement, but none of it sticks. Because the emptiness is not asking to be filled. It is asking to be respected. It exists to ensure that what comes next is not built on old incentives. This phase teaches a hard truth. Not all progress feels good. Some progress feels quiet. Some progress feels blank, because it is not adding, it is subtracting, and subtraction is invisible until you stop measuring by accumulation. You have been conditioned to expect immediate payoff. That conditioning is dissolving. What replaces it is a different orientation, one that does not move for reward, one that does not act to relieve pressure, one that does not chase validation. But that orientation cannot emerge while the old one is still active. So the system creates emptiness, not as punishment, not as test. As preparation. The moment you stop trying to escape this gap, you start to feel its purpose. The stillness becomes stable. The quiet becomes grounded. You begin to sense that nothing is wrong with you. Nothing is broken. You are not behind. You are in the only phase where nothing is supposed to happen. This is not the absence of life. It is the absence of distortion. And when distortion clears, reality does not rush in. It waits, because whatever comes next must be built on a foundation that no longer needs reward to move. That foundation is being laid right now, in silence, in emptiness, in a space that looks like nothing, but is doing everything. The field does not keep score. It does not remember how hard you tried. It does not care how much you endured. It does not pause to acknowledge your effort. That belief belongs to the old system, the one that taught you progress is earned through struggle. That endurance deserves reward. That if you suffer long enough, something must eventually arrive to justify it. The field does not work that way. It does not reward. It replaces. This is the illusion that collapses hardest at this stage. Because many people reach this point expecting compensation. They believe awareness should come with benefit. That growth should come with recognition. That letting go should be followed by gain. When none of that happens, they feel confused. Even betrayed. They think something failed. Nothing failed. The field never promised to pay you back. It only checks compatibility. That is all it does. It scans who you are being, not who you want to become, not what you believe you deserve, only what you are aligned with now. Effort does not increase compatibility. Suffering does not improve access. Time invested does not guarantee continuation. These ideas are human logic. The field operates on resonance. If a version of you no longer matches the environment you are in, the field does not argue. It does not negotiate. It does not slowly adjust. It replaces the configuration. This is why trying harder stopped working. Effort belongs to a timeline where friction was required to move. But once identity shifts, effort becomes irrelevant. You can still push, you can still force outcomes, but the field will not follow, because forcing is a signal of misalignment. The field does not meet intensity. It meets accuracy, and accuracy is quiet. This is why people get stuck after awakening experiences. They think insight is currency. That awareness should unlock rewards, but awareness is not a transaction. It is a change in access. Once access changes, the old paths close automatically, not as punishment, as update. The field does not care if you like this. It does not care if you understand it. It only responds to what is compatible now. And compatibility is not based on merit. It is based on coherence. If your internal state no longer matches the timeline you are in, you will feel friction. If your internal state no longer matches your old goals, they will feel empty. If your internal state no longer matches old incentives, they will stop motivating you. That is not loss. That is the field rerouting reality. This is where the illusion of spiritual progress breaks. Because many teachings promise improvement, more abundance, more clarity, more ease, but the field does not improve your current life. It replaces the framework entirely, sometimes with less at first, less stimulation, less validation, less external reward, because the new configuration cannot stabilize while the old one is still running. So the field does not add, it subtracts, it removes what is incompatible, even if you liked it, even if you worked hard for it, even if it once defined you. This is why the field feels indifferent, not cruel, not cold, indifferent. It does not see you as someone to be rewarded. It sees you as a system to be synchronized. And synchronization does not care about effort. It cares about fit. This can feel brutal if you are still operating under the logic of deserving. You may think, I have done the work. I have faced my fears. I have changed my patterns. Why is nothing showing up? Because showing up is not the next step. Clearing is the field removes misaligned structures before introducing new ones. Otherwise, the old identity would simply claim the reward and nothing would actually change. So the field withholds outcomes until the internal configuration is stable. That stability does not come from effort. It comes from release, from no longer trying to get something from reality, from no longer negotiating your worth through results. The moment you stop asking the field to reward you is the moment alignment begins to settle. Because asking for reward implies lack. It implies you are still acting from the old identity that needed proof. The field cannot meet that. It replaces it. This is why you may feel like nothing is happening, even though everything inside has changed. The old metrics no longer apply. You cannot measure progress by excitement, by achievement, by external confirmation. Those were tools of a previous timeline. The field is not building on top of them. It is building after them. This is also why comparison stops making sense. You see others chasing results, posting milestones, celebrating outcomes, and it feels distant, not because you are above it, but because you are no longer oriented toward reward. Your system has moved past transactional reality. That does not make you better. It makes you different. And different cannot be measured by the old scale. The field does not say you are ahead or behind. It only checks whether you match what you are trying to access. If you do not match, it will not open, no matter how much you want it, no matter how much you worked for it. This is not unfair. It is precise. The illusion that collapses here is the belief that effort creates reality. Effort only maintained the old identity. Alignment creates reality, and alignment cannot be forced. It emerges when nothing incompatible remains. That is why the field feels empty right now. It is not withholding, it is clearing. And clearing feels like nothing because nothing new can arrive until it is done. You are not waiting for reward. You are waiting for replacement, for a version of life that does not require struggle to sustain, for a structure that does not need motivation to function, for a reality that does not ask you to earn your place. That reality cannot coexist with the old one. So the field does not upgrade. It swaps quietly, impersonally, precisely. Once the swap is complete, the question of reward disappears because you will no longer be operating from a place that needs it. And that is the real shift. Not getting what you wanted, but no longer needing reality to pay you back, only needing it to match who you are now. And the field always does that, whether you agree or not. The space you are in is not a delay. It is the destination most people mistake for nothing. Everything is quieter now, less dramatic, less urgent. And that is exactly why it feels confusing. You were trained to recognize movement through pressure, through desire, through tension that pushed you forward. Now the pressure is gone. The absence of push feels wrong at first. You look around and think you must have stalled. You wonder if you lost momentum. You ask yourself whether you should want more, but wanting less is the signal. This phase is not marked by intensity. It is marked by clarity. There is less noise in your reactions, less compulsion in your decisions, less need to chase outcomes just to feel alive. That reduction feels like emptiness only because your system was calibrated to constant stimulation. The space phase arrives when stimulation is no longer required to keep you moving. This is why it feels like arrival without celebration. No rush of excitement, no dramatic relief, just a steady sense that nothing is pulling you off center anymore. That steadiness is unfamiliar. It can feel unsettling to those who equate purpose with urgency. You might notice that you no longer wake up driven by pressure. You do not feel pushed to prove yourself. You do not feel the same hunger to become someone else. Not because you gave up, because the chase is over. The space phase is where the old narrative fully dissolves. The story that said growth must hurt. The belief that success must feel intense. The idea that desire is the engine of life. None of that holds here. You still act. You still move. But the movement comes from alignment rather than impulse. That difference is subtle, and subtle changes are the hardest to trust. You may question whether you are doing enough, whether you should be more ambitious, whether comfort has replaced evolution. But this is not comfort. Comfort numbs. This phase sharpens. You notice more because you are not constantly reacting. You hear yourself think. You feel your body respond without force. You sense what is true without needing to justify it. This clarity does not shout. It whispers, and that whisper is easy to ignore if you are addicted to noise. This is why many people abandon the space phase. They confuse the absence of drama with stagnation. They mistake calm for loss of drive. They try to recreate urgency just to feel familiar again. And when they do, they step back into old timelines that already released them. The space phase is not passive. It is receptive. It is where your system stops broadcasting and starts listening. Listening not for instructions, but for resonance. You are no longer asking what you should do next. You are noticing what fits. That shift changes everything. You begin to see opportunities without chasing them. You recognize misalignment before it drains you. You sense when something is off without needing proof. This is what clarity feels like. Not excitement, precision. Less desire does not mean less life. It means desire is no longer driving your decisions. You act because it is coherent, not because it promises relief. This phase strips motivation down to what is real. And what is real rarely feels dramatic. The confusion comes from expectation. You expected arrival to feel bigger. You thought reaching a destination would bring a rush, a sense of achievement, a clear marker that says you made it. But this destination does not announce itself. It feels like nothing is missing. That is the sign. When nothing feels missing, the chase ends. And when the chase ends, space appears. That space is not empty. It is unoccupied. Unoccupied by fear. Unoccupied by compulsion. Unoccupied by the need to become. You are not waiting for something to happen. You are allowing something to form. And formation happens quietly. This phase does not require effort. It requires trust. Trust that you do not need to fill every gap. Trust that clarity does not need intensity to be valid. Trust that calm can be a sign of alignment rather than stagnation. The system you are in now is stable. It is not pushing you because it no longer needs to. You are already where you can hear what comes next. But if you rush, you will miss it. If you demand excitement, you will override it. If you label this phase as empty, you will try to escape it. And escaping it means re-entering noise. This is the most delicate stage of the shift. Not because it is fragile, but because it is misunderstood. It asks you to do less, to want less, to interfere less. That goes against everything you were taught about progress. But progress was never about accumulation. It was about alignment, and alignment feels spacious. You do not need to force meaning here. Meaning will emerge once the space stabilizes. You do not need to plan the next move. Movement will come when the configuration is ready. Right now, your only task is to remain compatible with the quiet, to let clarity settle without trying to decorate it. The space phase is not where you disappear. It is where you stop pretending to be pulled by things that no longer matter. That is not the end. It is the point where what comes next can finally land, without distortion, without pressure, without the old self claiming control. This is why the space feels like nothing, because nothing old is left to interfere. And when interference ends, reality does not rush in. It aligns silently, precisely, on its own time. And if you stay here long enough, you will recognize it, not as excitement, but as certainty, the quiet kind that does not ask for proof, only presence. You cannot go back, not because you evolved beyond it, not because you are stronger now, but because you no longer fit. That distinction matters. The old timeline is still there. Nothing erased it. Nothing destroyed it. People are still living inside it. Beliefs are still circulating. The same rhythms still repeat. You can step into it again if you want. But the moment you do, your body will tell you the truth. It will feel heavy, off tempo, like wearing something that once fit perfectly and now restricts every movement. This is not resistance. It is incompatibility. You did not outgrow the old timeline through effort. You outgrew it through perception. Your nervous system updated. What once felt normal now feels dense. What once felt engaging now feels slow. What once felt meaningful now feels performative. And that discomfort is not a flaw. It is physiology. Your system no longer processes reality the same way. You are not rejecting the old timeline consciously. Your body is rejecting it automatically. That is why returning feels exhausting. Not emotionally dramatic, physically wrong. You might notice it in subtle ways. Conversations drain you faster. Decisions take more energy than they should. Small compromises feel heavier than before. You start wondering why something that used to be easy now feels unbearable. It is not because you became sensitive. It is because your perception expanded, and expanded perception changes fit. The old timeline still operates on certain assumptions. That urgency equals importance. That reaction equals relevance. That pressure equals progress. Your system no longer responds to those cues. So when you place yourself back into that environment, it creates friction, not moral conflict, neurological mismatch. This is why trying to force yourself back never works for long. You can do it temporarily. You can push through. You can convince yourself it is practical, but it costs you more than it gives. Every interaction requires translation. Every decision demands suppression. Every moment asks you to shrink awareness just to function. That is not discipline. That is self-interference. And your system knows the difference. This is where people get confused. They think not going back means arrogance or avoidance or fear of regression. But none of that is accurate. You are not refusing the old timeline. It simply does not recognize you anymore. The signals it sends do not register the same way. The rewards it offers do not motivate you. The threats it uses do not control you. This is not superiority. It is misalignment. Trying to go back feels wrong because your internal calibration changed. And calibration is not a belief. It is a baseline. Once the baseline shifts, everything else has to adjust around it. You cannot unsee what you see. You cannot unfeel what your body recognizes. You cannot pretend urgency is meaningful when it no longer moves you. This is why the old timeline feels loud now. Not because it became chaotic, because you became quiet. Your system no longer needs constant input to orient itself. So when you re-enter environments built on stimulation, it overwhelms you, not mentally, somatically. Your shoulders tense, your breathing shortens, your attention scatters. These are not opinions, they are signals. Signals that say this frequency no longer matches your operating state. You may still love the people there. You may still understand the logic. You may still appreciate the structure, but appreciation is not fit. Fit is physiological, and physiology does not negotiate. This is why returning feels like regression, even if nothing objectively changed. Because regression is not about status. It is about coherence. Your system cannot sustain coherence in an environment that requires you to ignore what you now perceive. That perception is permanent. Once awareness crosses a certain threshold, it does not reverse. You can distract it, you can suppress it, you can override it for a while, but the cost increases each time. That cost shows up as fatigue, as irritability, as a sense of being out of place without knowing why. This is not punishment, it is guidance. Your system is guiding you away from what no longer fits, not towards something better, towards something compatible. That distinction matters. You are not being pulled forward by ambition. You are being pushed out by mismatch, and mismatch is neutral. It does not mean the old timeline was wrong. It does not mean you were wrong for living there. It means the configuration changed, and configurations do not revert. This is why advice from the old timeline feels hollow. People suggest going back to what worked, to what was stable, to what made sense. But stability that requires self-compression is no longer stable for you. It is costly. You feel it immediately. The weight, the drag, the internal resistance. This is not you being difficult. This is you being calibrated differently. Your nervous system now prioritizes coherence over familiarity. And coherence feels lighter, quieter, less dramatic. The old timeline still exists, but it was designed for a version of you that no longer runs the system. That version stepped aside, not heroically, naturally. You did not leave because you were brave. You left because staying stopped making sense at a biological level. And biology does not respond to arguments. It responds to fit. This is why you cannot go back. Not because you are above it, but because you are no longer shaped to live inside it. You can visit, you can observe, you can understand, but you cannot belong the same way. And that is not a loss. It is an update, one that does not announce itself, one that does not seek validation, one that simply makes certain paths unavailable because they no longer align with how your system now experiences reality. That is the truth you are feeling, even if you have not named it yet. And once you recognize it, the urge to force yourself back begins to fade. Not because you chose differently, but because your body already did, quietly, decisively, without asking for permission. That is why there is no return. Not because the door closed, but because you change shape. Nothing ahead of you comes with guarantees. There is no promise that it will be better. No assurance that it will be easier. No reassurance that everything will finally make sense. That is not an omission. It is the point. Promises were never about truth. They were about endurance. They existed to keep you aligned with paths that required sacrifice before honesty. They asked you to tolerate discomfort now for relief later. They trained you to postpone yourself. This phase removes that mechanism completely. No future version is offered as bait. No outcome is dangled to keep you compliant. No vision is painted to convince you to keep going. Only alignment remains. And alignment does not negotiate. It does not need promises because it does not operate on hope. It operates on accuracy. This is where many people feel exposed. Without promises, the mind loses leverage. It cannot motivate you with reward. It cannot scare you with loss. It has nothing to trade, so it panics. It asks whether this path is worth it, whether you are making a mistake, whether you should wait until there is more certainty. But certainty does not exist here, only coherence. And coherence does not explain itself in advance. It reveals itself through how little resistance you feel when you stop pretending. That is what alignment actually is. Not happiness, not success, not fulfillment as an idea. Alignment is the absence of internal contradiction. The moment when your actions no longer betray your perception, when your words no longer fight your body, when your choices stop pulling you away from yourself. This does not feel exciting at first. Excitement was fueled by anticipation, by the promise that something better was coming. Without that promise, excitement fades. What replaces it is steadiness. And steadiness feels unfamiliar to a system conditioned by pursuit. You may notice that you are no longer trying to convince yourself, no longer selling a future version of life to justify the present, no longer explaining why enduring something now will pay off later. You stop bargaining with yourself. That is alignment. It does not ask you to wait. It does not ask you to endure. It does not ask you to become someone else. It only asks you to stop living against what you already know. This is why there is no promise. Because promises assume a gap between who you are and who you need to be. Alignment assumes that gap is already closed. You are not being led toward a better version. You are being returned to a truer one. And truth does not need incentives. It is enough on its own. This can feel uncomfortable. Without promises, you cannot rely on faith in outcomes. You have to rely on resonance in the moment. You have to feel whether something fits rather than believe it will eventually work. That requires presence, and presence removes excuses. You can no longer justify misalignment by telling yourself it is temporary. You can no longer stay in situations that feel wrong by believing they lead somewhere. If it feels wrong now, it is wrong, not morally. Structurally, this is why alignment feels ruthless. It does not soften itself to protect your expectations. It does not compromise to preserve comfort. It simply reveals whether you are in sync or not. And if you are not, it becomes impossible to ignore. This does not make life easier. In some ways, it makes it more demanding because you can no longer hide behind narratives. You can no longer live on borrowed meaning. You can no longer accept futures that require you to deny the present. But what it gives you is something far more stable, integrity, not as a concept, as a lived condition. You begin to feel when something is off immediately, not after consequences, not after exhaustion. Immediately, that clarity reshapes everything. You may do less, want less, move slower, but every movement is cleaner. There is no internal argument running in the background, no tension between what you see and what you choose. You stop asking whether something will be worth it. You ask whether it is honest, and honesty becomes the only measure that matters. This is why there is no promise of improvement. Improvement implies comparison. Alignment does not compare. It simply aligns. You are not told it will be easier because ease is not guaranteed. Some truths are heavy. Some alignments require letting go of things you still value, but they will not require you to betray yourself. That is the one certainty. You will no longer live against your own perception. That does not mean life becomes smooth. It means friction becomes meaningful. You know why something is difficult. You know what the cost is. You choose it consciously rather than out of fear or hope. That choice changes the quality of effort. Effort is no longer self-denial. It becomes expression. This is the quiet reward that is never advertised. Not joy, not abundance, self-congruence. When your inner and outer realities stop arguing, that state does not need promises because it does not depend on future validation. It is sufficient now. You do not need to know where this leads. You only need to know whether you are aligned in this moment. If you are, the next step will reveal itself, not dramatically, not as a vision, as a natural movement that does not feel forced. This is how alignment guides. It does not pull you forward with reward. It removes what no longer fits until movement becomes obvious. That process cannot be rushed. It cannot be explained ahead of time. It cannot be sold, which is why no promise is made. You are not being recruited into a future. You are being released from living against yourself. And once that happens, the idea of promises loses its grip. You stop asking life to convince you. You start listening to whether it resonates. That shift is irreversible, because once you experience alignment, anything else feels like compromise. Not dramatic compromise, subtle erosion, and you notice it immediately. This is the destination without promise, not a place, not a result, a state where you no longer need to be promised anything in order to remain true, where the absence of guarantees does not scare you because you are no longer moving toward an idea of life. You are living inside what is real for you now, and that reality does not need to be better. It needs to be honest. Everything else can be negotiated, but not that. And you already know the difference, even if you never had words for it before. That knowing is what alignment feels like. Quiet, undeniable, and final. This is where the old loop closes. Not with resolution, not with explanation, not with a clear ending that tells you what to do next. It closes because it no longer needs to continue. You have already stepped out of the cycle that required answers, out of the phase that demanded reassurance, out of the identity that needed direction to feel safe. What remains now is not instruction. It is recognition. This moment, if you are in it, there is no urgency to act, no impulse to share, no desire to convince anyone of what you understand. Something is settled. The questions that once drove you quieted, not because they were solved, but because they lost relevance. This is how loops actually end. Not when everything makes sense, but when you stop needing it to. Most systems end by offering a conclusion, a takeaway, a final promise that ties everything together. This one does not, because the next phase cannot be entered through agreement. It requires resonance, and resonance cannot be argued into existence. It either happens or it does not. That is why nothing is being asked of you here. No action, no commitment, no response. If you are trying to decide whether this applies to you, then it does not. If you are waiting for a signal to move forward, then you are not ready. The signal is not external. It is internal recognition, a quiet sense that something you have been circling around has finally come into view, not as an idea. As a state, you may notice that you are less interested in content now, less hungry for explanations, less drawn to narratives that promise change. Not because you know everything, because you are no longer searching. That does not mean the journey is over. It means the mode has changed. You are no longer consuming to fill a gap. You are selecting based on fit. That distinction matters. The next layer is not for everyone, not because it is exclusive, but because it is unnecessary for most. Only those who feel a specific pull will recognize it. Not excitement, not curiosity, recognition. The kind that feels familiar before it feels new. You will not feel compelled to talk about it. You will not feel the need to explain why. You will simply know that something aligns, and alignment does not shout. It waits. This is why there is no invitation. Invitations imply persuasion. There is nothing to persuade here. If you feel nothing, that is correct. Nothing is missing. If you feel a subtle pull without urgency, that is also correct. That pull is not toward information. It is toward coherence. The old loop asked you to understand. The new one asks you to participate, not through effort, through presence. Participation here does not mean doing more. It means interfering less. It means allowing what already fits to organize itself further. This is not a path you enter by clicking something. It is a space you notice yourself already standing near. You recognize it by how little explanation it needs, by how calm your system feels when you consider it, by the absence of internal negotiation. If you are looking for reassurance, this is not it. If you are looking for clarity, this is not it. If you are looking for direction, this is not it. Those belong to the previous loop. This phase assumes you already trust your internal calibration, that you can sense when something is aligned without being told, that you can move without being pushed, that you can pause without fearing stagnation. The people who arrive here do not arrive together. There is no announcement, no countdown, no shared moment. Each recognizes it privately, and that privacy is important because what comes next is not built on consensus. It is built on coherence. Coherence does not require numbers. It requires accuracy. This is why the door does not open outward. It opens inward. You will not find a sign that says you are ready. You will find that you are no longer looking for signs. That is the only qualification. The loop closes quietly. The content ends not because it ran out, but because it no longer needs to speak. Silence becomes more informative than explanation. You may find yourself revisiting these words later, not to understand them, but to notice how little they need to say now. That is how something shifted. The need for guidance dissolved into orientation. Orientation does not require direction. It simply knows where not to go. And that is enough. If something in you recognizes this space, then you already know what to do. Not specifically, naturally, you will not rush. You will not announce. You will not seek confirmation. You will follow what feels precise, quietly, without drama, without proof. This is the open loop, not unfinished, unforced. The old cycle is complete. The new one does not begin with a step. It begins with stillness. And only those who are comfortable there will notice what opens next. No promise is made. None is needed. Because if you are here, you are no longer moving for assurance. You are moving because something aligns. And alignment always finds its own way forward. Without being asked,